guidance in our deliberations on behalf of the people of the Colac Otway Shire. Enable this Council's decisions to be those that contribute to the true welfare and betterment of our community. Amen. Can I ask that Council staff record all those present today? I note that there are nil apologies or leaves of absence. I would like to start this afternoon by acknowledging the traditional custodians and lawmakers of this land, their elders past, present, and welcome any descendants here today. I would like to advise that this submissions committee meeting is being held via video conference due to the current COVID-19 restrictions. This meeting is being live streamed, including the public participation sections of the meeting. The recording of the live stream of this afternoon's meeting will be able to be accessed via the website as soon as practical. By participating in open committee meetings, individuals consent to the use and disclosure of the information they share at the meeting, including any personal and/or sensitive information. Please note that it is an offence to make an unauthorised recording of the meeting. The sole purpose of this submissions committee meeting is for the hearing of submissions for the proposed sale of land at 36 to 52 Bruce Street, Colac. Are there any declarations of interest, please? No? Okay. I propose that we move to confirm the minutes from the submissions committee meeting held on the 9th of June 2021. Do I have a mover? Councillor Hart, seconder Councillor Potter. Is it to be opposed? Okay, all those in favour? Okay, the item's carried 7-0. Council has received one request to be heard this afternoon. A limit of 5 minutes applies for each person who has requested to be heard. We have one submitted, Jason Schran. Okay, now we move to item 8.1, Bruce Street land sale, section 223 submissions committee. Okay, we'll now hear from the verbal submission for item 8.1 from Mr. Jason Schram. When you're ready, Mr. Schram.
No worries. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you. First, this council needs to stop the current process of the proposed sale of the Bruce Street land because it has failed in its obligations of community consultation, breaching its own community engagement policy and breaching the Local Government Act when selling public land. Holding a submissions hearing for the proposed sale of Bruce Street after the for sale expressions of interest is closed is as absurd as it sounds. At no time did this council undertake any community engagement prior to its May 26th resolution to put the land out to expression of interest, which limited the market to accepting applications from only those that must have a minimum 15% social housing element in their application. At no time did council seek any input from the community to sell this valuable public asset, nor did it seek community input into what the community may like to see develop on the site, how the site is to be developed, nor any input from the community or nearby residents on what they may want to see go into the expression of interest process. The only consultation done was after the fact of the May 26 resolution and done under the guise of the Local Government Act mandatory 4 weeks consultation when selling public land, then having this submissions hearing today after the expressions of interest sale process is closed. I ask, what will council change now the process for sale has concluded? The resolution also goes against council's own adopted policy of social housing that indicates all new developments should aim to have 4.9% social housing built into these new developments. As the policy states, 1 in 20 houses could be sustainable for social housing, not 1 in 7, as we all know the mistakes of the past by condensing social housing into undesirable and low socio-economic areas within the community. A very important policy to try and include more social housing, but this council has opted to devalue the land and limit the maximum potential sale value by disregarding its own adopted policy and no consultation with the community. The expression of interest process should have allowed for all offers of the Bruce Street site, regardless of any partnerships for cheap housing, so the council could have compared the sale price offers of the value of the land, but also allowing for higher scored expressions of interest that council was trying to achieve with the social housing element. You have failed the people of this shire. What's more, council have consulted should have consulted the community to seek best value for this land in both terms of community benefit and monetary return to the ratepayer. You have failed to do this. It is, after all, our asset. Council needs to look more closely and scope out in more detail the prospect of developing this land yourselves. You have possession of the golden goose. You should not cook the golden goose for a quick headline about speeding up the release of residential land in a time of crisis. It has been zoned residential for 20 years. You should let it lay the golden eggs that this community has longed for over many years. Council needs to take control of this land, the development of the land, and reap the benefits of a $10 million plus windfall by developing and selling the lots yourselves. You can then work with social housing providers to achieve this need. Offer discounts to local first home builders on selling lots of land to accommodate more affordable housing. Guide the development as you have the resources to do so at your fingertips. You have a planning department, although you may not want to work with yourselves, as you all know how difficult the planning department is to work with. Council builds roads and it builds footpaths. With this parcel of land, council could get 65 lots, probably more. And in today's market, that equates to $16.5 million in land sales. It may cost about $5 million to put in the infrastructure, but loaning money has never been so affordable, and the council is in a great position to do so. The rewards outweigh the risk tenfold. Imagine what this and future councils can do for the ratepayer with an extra $10 million. You can fund the Changing Places facility in the square, build footpaths in towns, improve drainage, fund design and development overlays on residential land to unlock housing, make some real changes, build cycling, walking paths, build new infrastructure that will otherwise never be budgeted for. Don't throw away $10 million of ratepayer money in haste. Another factor not to sell this land yet is the environment cut-off wall that needs to be built. This has not been budgeted for, and staff have indicated to myself that they will pay for it out of the sale of the land. That is ridiculous. Not only should this cut-off wall be paid for out of the waste reserve, how could council put out a potentially $500,000 plus job out for tender with no budget for it, no council resolution on what they may do with money, and where's it going to come from? What's going to miss out in this year's budget to pay for that wall? What happens if they spend the sale of the money on all this wall? What was the purpose of selling the Bruce Street land? It may also take 12 months before this wall was built, if it's even awarded to tender, and that may hold up any development and any testing of the wall to make sure it works. So you need to get your ducks in a row before this goes out for sale. Also in the report for the wall, it states that the report and the wall were developed with the intent that low-density residential development may occur in the future. It may only be wording, but if there is a future gas leak from the waste side into the residential homes and a legal fight occurs, low density and general residential are two very different zones in terms of housing density within the Colac Otway Shire. So please end the current process of the sale of Bruce Street, show some humility and conduct proper community consultation for the sale of our most valuable asset. Get the environment wall sorted out first, who may take future responsibility of it and ownership of it. Consider all the options and costs of developing the land yourselves that will reap maximum value for the community in terms of social and affordable housing and the huge monetary windfall for the ratepayer and residents, or at the very least, go out to the open market to gauge the different values you may get from this land, including having the elements of social housing aiming for 4.9%, so that the community gets maximum value, not just now, but for many years to come. We, the people, deserve this from our council. There was not one submission in support of council's process to sell or its intentions to sell the land with high concentration of social housing. Don't cook the golden goose. Thanks, councillors. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Schramm. Now, do councillors have any questions of Mr. Schramm? No questions of Mr. Schramm. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your submission today.
Not a problem. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you. Okay. Now, do councillors have any questions of officers? Yep, Councillor McCracken.
Thanks, Mayor. Look, obviously, as a result of what we've just heard, can council officers confirm that we've either, conformed with the regulations and whatnot that's set out in the Local Government Act or not? And indeed, have we complied with our own policies, particularly with regard to the social housing that was just mentioned in the submission?
Okay, Mr. Thurin, would you like to comment?
Yeah, through you, Mayor. Yes, we have complied with the Local Government Act, and we have legal advice to confirm that. So there's no issues. From our perspective, we've certainly met the requirements of our community engagement policy as well. In terms of the need for social housing, that's well established, and the social housing plan that council has just adopted certainly identifies that.
Okay, Councillor Hart.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Schramm, for your submission and your comments today. My question, Mayor, relates to other processes for community input, and also the suggestion by another submission. It wasn't Mr. Schramm's, it was another. There could be up to 340 buildings on this site. Is that correct? And will there be, if a developer were to buy this site, is there any other process where the community will have input into exactly what goes on the particular site?
Through Mr. Thurin?
Yeah, through you, Mayor. I might ask Mr. McNeil to answer that one.
Thanks, Mr. Thurin. Through you, Mayor. Any development of this site would need a planning permit and would need to go through a normal planning process. So whether it's council selling to someone who then puts forward a proposal to develop the land, or whether it was anyone else in any other circumstance, any subdivision or use of the land will need a planning permit. So the normal process of that would include a public notice process under the Planning Environment Act, and we would need to consider any objections that are lodged by any residents in relation to those proposals before making a decision, and making a decision on the basis of the planning scheme policies and provisions that are relevant and applicable. I think any reference to several hundred buildings on the site is probably something that would be in excess of what would be expected given the policy framework. I think it'd be difficult to say that you would have a subdivision that's proposing that many dwellings on the site. What we've sought through the expression of interest process is proposals from potential purchasers to see what they think might be possible, and the process of assessing those is to see what might be appropriate for the area given the site's context, as well as meeting the other provisions of the EOI around provision of social housing and sustainability and so on. I might also just make a comment that the reference by Mr. Schramm to the 4.9% social housing being required in new housing developments isn't applicable in this situation. That social housing plan objective is about when council's talking to proponents of new greenfield residential subdivision where rezonings are occurring to achieve development of land that's currently zoned farming or some other zone, that we would seek to negotiate something around that figure as a percentage of new houses in any future developments. It doesn't apply to land that's already zoned where land could be developed under the current zoning framework. And in this particular instance, it's council-owned land, and it's council who is it's council that's instigated the desire to see social housing provided on this site. And the council has a choice as to what degree it provides social housing on the property. 15% is the figure that council landed on when it considered this at the May council meeting, and that was after receiving advice from an expert in social housing provision who had been advising council prior to that time, who indicated that that level of social housing would be acceptable in terms of integration of future residents with other buyers of land in the subdivision.
Councillor Potter.
Thanks, Mayor. I just have a question in relation to our capacity to change horses, so to speak, in relation to this process, or make some alterations, such as one submitter in writing suggested a social housing component of 5%, and we've heard from Mr. Schramm in relation to developing the land ourselves or removing social housing altogether. Do we have the capacity in our procedures to do all or any of those things, or make other changes that we see fit?
Mr. Surin?
Yeah, through you, Mayor. So I think it's important to understand the process that we're going through. So we've called for expressions of interest. Council still needs to evaluate those expressions of interest and find a way forward in terms of selling the land. So at any stage of the process, council can, if there's no expressions of interest that they feel suits what we're after, council can then reconsider which direction it goes, reminding councillors that there was a resolution of council regarding the 15% social housing.
Councillor McCracken.
Thanks, Mayor. Look, I wanted to go back to this sort of process of hearing submissions. It sort of does appear to be almost counterintuitive in a way, because we're hearing submissions when a previous sort of process has been closed off. I just want to get some clarification as to, two processes running at the same time, so we can all have a very clear understanding of what's happening in what order. And I understand the reason is to speed up the process to get an outcome, but I think for those watching on, and indeed even just for our own benefit, to clarify that, I'd want to get a clear image of that, please.
Mr. Surin, can you make comment on that?
Yeah, through you, Mayor. Thanks for the question, Councillor McCracken. Yes, there are two processes happening in parallel, and that is to try and speed up the process. So one is to consider council actually selling the land. So there's an in-principle agreement to do that, and through the Local Government Act, we need to advertise our intention to do so and call for submissions from the community, which we've done, and that's what today's meeting is about, to understand whether the community has the appetite to actually sell the land, and then council will need to make a final decision on that. The other part of the process is that we've called for expressions of interest in terms of purchasing the land and how that would be developed, including the 15% social housing. So they're the two processes that are running in parallel at the moment.
Can I have a quick
Through you, Mayor, if I could just clarify over and above Mr. Surin's comments, they are very distinctly different processes. And so one is about council's intention to sell and seeking community submissions, and the other process is about asking the market to indicate to council what it's prepared to develop the site and for what price. And that's for a separate decision of council down the track to make about that. But in the first instance, this is just about whether council should sell the land, and that's why we're hearing the submissions today. And there's really no disadvantage to the community in the process of hearing those submissions by having the two run in parallel.
Councillor McCracken, you had a follow-up question?
Yeah, I was just going to say, would it be fair to say that there could be a perception out there that council might have already considered or had made a decision to sell by putting out an expression of interest already to develop the land? Now, I know what you say about, two separate processes, but I don't know, it could appear that it's sort of already a decision's been made. Can you clarify that?
Mr. Surin, would you like to make comment, or Mr. McNeil?
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Through you. So officers are undertaking this process based on a previous resolution of council that provided in principle support to sell the land. So there still needs to be a final decision on that, but we're acting on that resolution of council.
Councillor Hart.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Excuse me. Just on the same subject, is it still open for council, having listened to the submissions, to decide not to sell the land, or by going out for an expression of interest, have we effectively prevented ourselves from having that option? So having listened to submissions, do we still have the option of saying, well, we're not going to sell the land, or is that the fact we did these two things at the same time that we must sell it now because we've gone out for an expression of interest?
Okay, Mr. Surin.
Yeah, through you, Mayor. No, just because we've gone out for an expression of interest doesn't mean that council can determine to sell the land or not. I'll remind councillors that in terms of calling for expressions of interest, that's the first part of a process. So we're council to continue with that after the evaluation of EOIs. There'd be a second part of that process which would call for requests for proposal to put more meat around an expression of interest.
Thank you.
That makes no sense whatsoever.
Councillor McCracken, did you have your hand up? Oh, no, okay.
If I could, sorry, Mayor, could I just make a comment again, adding to what Mr. Surin has just said? I think Mr. Hart, Councillor Hart, your question was around are we bound by either of these two processes to continue on with the process? I think what we're saying is that in neither of the two processes is there any binding obligation on council. So the current process around hearing submissions on the intention to sell, council can make a decision on these submissions not to proceed to sell. And equally with the expression of interest process, council can make a decision to terminate that process at any time. There's no obligation to continue on with it if council had a change of mind.
Okay. Can I ask a question? And it just relates to the cut-off wall, the bentonite wall, and I think it was mentioned in the submission that it was, they mentioned, Mr. Schramm mentioned that it was for low density and that it would suit low density development. I think it might have been in the engineer's report. Can you make comment on that? Like, because no doubt it'll most likely be developed for general residential, and there is a difference, I believe, between general residential and low density.
Through you, Mayor, yeah, I've certainly not ever been aware of any limitation of how the site can be developed for a normal general subdivision's density that you'd expect in this area. That's certainly an issue that we can take on notice from today to revisit and prior to council making a formal decision to make sure that that's correct. But I'm certainly not aware of anything that would inhibit what we've already pursued through this process.
Thank you. That would be good if you did take that on notice. Councillor Potter.
Thanks, Mayor. Just a follow-up question to yours, Mayor, if I can, for clarification from Mr. McNeil. What is low-density housing? Can you define that for us?
Through you, Mayor, I'm sure there's no real specific definition of low-density housing. Yeah, you've got all sorts of densities of housing. There's 20 or 30 story apartment buildings in Melbourne versus a single-storey house, and any number of options in between, yard sizes that range from 200 or 300 square metres to 800, 1,000 square metres. So I think, as I've indicated in my previous answer, we'll go away after today just to revisit the wording of those documents, just to make sure that there isn't anything there that would adversely affect this. But based on my knowledge of the process to date, I wasn't aware that there was anything from that would inhibit a normal subdivision density of this site.
I've just got one last question about the. My understanding is the funds needed to build the cut-off wall would be hasn't been budgeted for and would come out of the sale of the land. Is that correct? Is my understanding correct?
Yeah, through you, Mayor. If council was to build the cut-off wall, it would be on the basis that you're selling the land. If council was to choose not to sell the land for any reason in this process, council wouldn't be proceeding to build the cut-off wall. So by reason, then the cut-off wall is only going to occur and need to be funded if it's then getting a return of a financial value from the sale of the land to fund those works.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from councillors? No. Councillors, we have a recommendation before us. Do I have a mover? Councillor Potter, do I have a seconder? Councillor White, is it to be opposed? Councillor Potter as the mover.
I won't speak to it, Mayor. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. We'll have more opportunity to talk at next time this is considered.
Councillor White?
Thanks. Thanks through you, Mayor. Just to remember that making ability for social housing aligns with the social housing policy that we've just adopted, and that people who require social housing are people of our community too, and we need to remind ourselves that in making that decision to have social housing included in this is meeting the needs of sections of our community as well.
Thank you. Does any other councillor wish to speak? Councillor Hart.
Thanks, Mayor, and thanks, Mr. Schramm, for your verbal submission today. I'll be supporting this resolution. I hope that the council report, I think it needs, when it does come to council, to address the key points of the various submitters, particularly what might be developed potentially on the site, because there seems to be some concern, at least amongst one submitter, that there's potential for 340 buildings. I thought that it was more likely to be perhaps 70 or 80 or even less than that. And I think there also needs to be some clarity about particularly which parcel of land is or might be sold, because there's some discussion about lakefront land in the submissions. But my understanding is certainly it's not the land at the fronting the lake directly that would be sold. And I think there needs to be a clear details around exactly what's been sold and what's not been sold, and what relates to the former landfill and what wasn't part of the former landfill.
Does any other councillor wish to speak? I might briefly speak. I'd like to thank all the submitters, Mr. Schramm for making his verbal submission, and the people that made submissions in writing. This is a community asset, and it's it's not an easy thing. I think when the community decides to or not to sell land, there is a big interest in it, and it's a complex site, or it's a site that does have some complexities. And I'd like to thank the officers for the work they have done, but also for the fact that they've taken some items on notice tonight. and I also echo Councillor Hart in that I look forward to them addressing the concerns that have been raised in submissions. Thank you. Councillors, I will now call for a vote. All those in favour? The item's carried 7-0. Thank you, councillors. That concludes this submissions committee meeting of the Colac Otway Shire. I declare this meeting closed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor.